Good evening, everyone. We have spent this series exploring the architecture of self-esteem, how it is built, how it protects us, and how it can sometimes lead us astray. Tonight, we turn to a question that lies at the very heart of how we evaluate ourselves. It is a question about the gap between who we are and who we feel we should be. Each of us carries in the back of our minds a collection of possible selves, visions of the person we might become, for better or worse. And each of us measures our actual self against internal standards, what psychologists call self-guides. When those measurements reveal a gap, we feel it. The nature of that feeling, sadness or anxiety, guilt or hope, depends on which guide we are falling short of and which possible self we are drifting toward. Tonight, we will explore these self-guides, the emotional consequences of failing to meet them, and the way multiple roles in our lives can either fracture us or make us whole. Part 1. Possible Selves, the Future in Our Minds. Our self-concept does not only describe who we are now, it reaches forward into the future. Psychologists Markus and Nurius introduced the concept of possible selves in 1986. These are our conceptions of what we might become. They include hoped-for selves, the successful, loved, healthy person we wish to be, and feared selves, the alone, unsuccessful, diminished person we dread becoming. These possible selves are not idle daydreams. They function as future-oriented incentives for behavior. We act in the present to move toward our hoped-for selves and away from our feared ones. A young medical student pulls an all-nighter not merely because she is conscientious, but because she can vividly imagine her hoped-for self, the competent doctor saving lives, and equally vividly imagine her feared self, the dropout who disappointed her family. These images pull and push her forward. The self is not a photograph, it is a film, and the next frames are already shaping the present. Part 2. Self-discrepancy theory, the gap between who we are and who we should be. But possible selves also create standards. And when our current self falls short of those standards, we suffer. This is the insight at the core of self-discrepancy theory, developed by Tori Higgins in 1987. The theory proposes that self-esteem is powerfully shaped by the gaps between different aspects of the self. There are 3 key domains. The actual self is how you see yourself right now. The ideal self is how you would like to be, your hopes, wishes, and aspirations. The ought self is how you think you ought to be, your sense of duty, responsibility, and moral obligation. When the actual self falls short of the ideal self, we feel dejection, sadness, disappointment, dissatisfaction. When the actual self falls short of the ought self, we feel agitation, guilt, anxiety, shame. Let me bring these discrepancies to life. Part 3. Actual versus ideal, the weight of unfulfilled hopes. Elena's actual self is a 34-year-old accountant who spends her days in a cubicle processing spreadsheets. She is competent and well-paid, but she feels hollow. Her ideal self is a touring musician, free, creative, and emotionally expressive. She imagines this version of herself playing guitar in dimly lit clubs, writing songs that move people. The gap between the two is vast and painful. Every time she sees a friend's band post about a gig, she feels a sharp pang of disappointment and sadness. She tells herself, "That should be me." This discrepancy does not make her anxious or guilty, it makes her quietly despondent. She often thinks, "I'm wasting my potential," and experiences frequent low moods. The dejection is a direct result of her actual self failing to live up to her ideal. Or consider Maya. She is 38 and has always dreamed of a loving partnership and children. Her ideal self is a devoted wife and mother, surrounded by family warmth. Her actual self is single after a series of relationships that didn't last. At her younger cousin's wedding, the discrepancy becomes unbearable. As she watches the couple exchange vows, she feels a wave of sadness, not envy. She isn't angry at anyone, she simply feels a deep sense of personal failure and loss for the life she hoped she would be living by now. Later, alone in her hotel room, she cries quietly. She thinks, I always thought I'd have this by now. What's wrong with me? The emotion is pure dejection, disappointment and sadness over the gap between her actual and ideal selves. And then there is Amara. Her ideal self is a confident, eloquent barrister arguing landmark cases in front of a captivated courtroom. She imagined herself in a wig and gown, defending the vulnerable and winning justice. Her actual self is a 42-year-old paralegal who has spent 20 years doing case research and filing documents for other lawyers. She never went to law school. Life, money, and fear got in the way. When she sees news footage of a high-profile trial, she feels a deep, hollow sadness. She thinks, that was my dream. I could have been there. She is not anxious or guilty. She has not failed any duty. She simply feels a chronic, low-level disappointment with herself. She often describes her life as fine but not what I hoped for. The gap between her actual and ideal selves leaves her with a persistent sense of dissatisfaction and a quiet grief for the person she never became. Part 4, Actual versus Ought, the sting of failed duty. When the gap is not between who we are and who we wish to be, but between who we are and who we believe we ought to be, the emotional signature changes entirely. We move from dejection to agitation. David's ought self is a reliable, present father who never lets his children down. His own father was absent and unreliable, and David has sworn to be different. One week, an urgent work deadline consumes his evenings, and he misses his daughter's school play despite promising to be there. His daughter is understanding, but David is flooded with guilt. He replays the moment she scanned the audience for him and didn't see him. He thinks, I'm just like my father. I broke my promise. The emotion isn't sadness about a missed aspiration. It's anxiety, guilt, and a burning sense that he has failed his duty. He feels agitated, restless, and can't sleep, berating himself for not living up to his ought self. Consider Priya, a mother of 2 young children. Her ought self is a calm, endlessly patient caregiver who never raises her voice, the kind of mother she believes she has a responsibility to be. One evening, after a sleepless night and a stressful day at work, her 4-year-old throws a tantrum over dinner. Priya snaps. She screams at her child, far louder than the situation warrants, and sees fear flicker in her daughter's eyes. The child cries herself to sleep. Priya spends the night feeling physically sick with guilt and shame. She thinks, what kind of mother does that? I ought to be better. The emotion is not sadness about an unfulfilled hope but agitated guilt. Her heart races, she cannot sit still, and she replays the moment in her head, berating herself for failing her most fundamental responsibility. These 2 discrepancies, actual versus ideal, actual versus ought, produce different forms of psychological pain. One is the ache of a dream deferred. The other is the burn of a duty broken. And both motivate us to change. We strive to close the gap, to bring our actual self into alignment with our guides. That striving is the engine of self-regulation. Part 5, the feared self, the person we run from. There is a third self-guide, less discussed but equally powerful, the feared self. This is the person we worry about becoming. The farther we are from this feared self, the better we feel. Liam's father was an angry, bitter man who drank heavily, lost his job when Liam was a teenager, and spent his later years blaming everyone else for his failures. Liam's childhood was marked by slammed doors, unpredictable rage, and the smell of alcohol. From a young age, Liam formed a vivid feared self, a man just like his father, resentful, unemployed, and alienated from his own family. This feared self became a powerful motivational force. Liam worked hard in school, built a stable career as an architect, and practiced strict moderation with alcohol. He married and became a father himself, and he consciously chose patience and gentleness over the volatility he grew up with. Now in his late 30s, he sometimes catches a glimpse of his father in the mirror, a certain expression, the shape of his jaw, and feels a flicker of unease. But when he sits at the dinner table with his children, laughing and asking about their day, the distance from that feared self feels immense and deeply reassuring. He thinks, I am not him. I broke the pattern. That distance is a source of quiet, sustained contentment. The farther he moves from the feared self, the more at peace he feels. The dread of becoming his father has not paralyzed him. It has guided him toward a life he genuinely values. Part 6: Self-Complexity and the Balancing Act of Multiple Roles. All of this, the hopes, the duties, the fears, plays out across the many roles we inhabit. And here, an important concept comes into view: self-complexity. Patricia Linville, in 1985, proposed that having a large number of distinct and non-overlapping self-aspects can act as a buffer against stress. If one identity is threatened or fails, a person can focus on other, positive identities to maintain well-being. Low self-complexity, by contrast, makes a person more vulnerable to swings in mood and illness following stress. But the quantity of roles is only part of the story. Multiple role theory adds a crucial nuance: the quality of those roles matters more than the number. Conflict between roles can cause significant distress. When roles are integrated and aligned, well-being is enhanced. Consider Fatima. She is a dedicated high school teacher and a mother of 3 young children. She values both roles deeply, but they feel like 2 separate warring selves. In the classroom, she feels guilty for not being with her children. At home, she feels guilty for not marking papers or preparing lessons. She is constantly exhausted, torn, and feels she is failing at both roles. The conflict between teacher and mother generates chronic stress and anxiety. She cannot find a way to reconcile the two. They simply compete for her time and emotional energy. Her well-being suffers not because she has too many roles, but because the relationship between those roles is combative and zero-sum. The quantity of roles is not the problem. The quality of the relationship between them is. Now consider Grace. She is a nurse practitioner and a mother of 2 teenagers. Unlike Fatima, Grace has found a way to integrate her roles. She sees her career not as something that takes her away from her children, but as a powerful way to model compassion, resilience, and purpose. She talks to her children about why her work matters, and she brings those values home. When her daughter volunteers at a community clinic, Grace feels a profound alignment between being a mother and a healthcare professional. On hard days, she reminds herself that showing her children how to handle stress with grace is part of her job as a parent. The roles reinforce each other. The boundaries still exist, but the psychological experience is one of harmony, not conflict. This integration enhances her self-esteem and buffers against burnout. Fatima and Grace have the same number of demanding roles. The difference is not in the load but in the narrative. One experiences her roles as enemies, the other experiences them as partners in a shared project of a meaningful life. What we take with us. The self is not a static thing. It is a dynamic system of guides, possibilities, and roles, all pulling us in different directions. Understanding this system gives us a map of our own discontent. When you feel a wave of sadness, ask yourself, is this the ache of an ideal self I have not yet reached? When you feel a surge of guilt, ask, is this the sting of an ought self I have failed to honor? When you feel a quiet, steady relief, ask, is this the comfort of knowing I am far from the person I most fear becoming? And when your roles feel like they are tearing you apart, consider not just how many you hold, but how you are holding them. Are they competitors, or can they become collaborators? The mother and the teacher, the nurse and the parent, these do not have to be warring selves. They can be different expressions of the same core values, different instruments in the same symphony. The gaps between who we are and who we want to be will never fully close. That is not failure. That is the human condition. The goal is not to eliminate all discrepancies, but to ensure that the ones that remain are generative, pulling us forward, not pulling us apart. To hold our ideal selves with hope rather than despair, our ought selves with responsibility rather than self-laceration, and our feared selves as distant warnings rather than imminent fates. That is the art of living with the self you have while reaching for the self you imagine. Thank you.